All right, hello everyone. I'm going to be breaking down Erlenberg here, which this map strategy is going to go over key routes, key positions, and also tactics that you can use on the new version of Erlenberg here. Prior to World of Tanks 1.0, this was completely different map. Like from a bird's eye view, you notice similarities with the river and also kind of the outer flanks being a little bit open, especially the castles more or less in the same spot. However, this map has largely changed entirely how you actually want to play this, and it's probably going to be one of the harder maps to play in World of Tanks. So I'm going to go over some strategies and also little tips that you can use to play Erlenberg. I also have a fully written map strategy guide over on my website, watguru.com. There's going to be a link at the end of the video, and also there's a link in the video description below that you can pop over to the full written guide. So anyway, let me pull up what you can find on my written guide here, kind of the map strategy I drew up here. So looking at this, first of all, you'll notice that compared to the old version of Erlenberg, there's a lot more going on in the center. There's a lot more buildings and basically tactical options you can use, and a lot more tanks there. But more or less, Erlenberg, I broke it down to 3 different flanks. You have the castle on the 1 to 3 line. You have the town in the 4 to 7 lines in the center, and then you have the railway over in the 8 to 0 lines. Now, more or less, people associate Erlenberg with, usually you would want to stay on the outer flanks, bulk the bulk of your forces, and basically the center, maybe some like light tanks and stuff went to prior. It kind of changed now to where the outer flanks are still important. However, the center is a lot more important because there's a lot of cover there for heavy tanks, tank destroyers, even mediums can work there, and basically you can support the outer flanks from there without just getting annihilated in the center. And you can even say push directly through the center, so on and so forth. But anyway, so looking at this strategy a little closer, you'll notice the castle side on the 1 to 3 side. The northern team that I have highlighted in yellow, you'll notice it's a little bit, they have to push a little bit further out there. The downside of, the castle side for the northern team is there aren't many bushes and basically long range cover for like tank destroyers and other tanks to kind of support at range. You'll notice in the B line there's a couple spots, but really there's a couple buildings and a couple little bushes you can use, but they're not exactly safe, and if you're firing from there on enemies kind of pushing through the castle, you're most likely going to get lit up and you're going to get killed because there's no real large amount of cover there. Compare that to the southern team that I have outlined in blue. More or less, they don't have to push as far north on the castle side. However, you'll notice in the K line, there's a whole swath of trees there. They even have like a hill in H1 like the other side does. But more or less, that side has a lot more options available to it as far as tanks pushing forward, some supporting from the back, to where it's a little bit easier for them to kind of set up and defend if need be. They don't necessarily have to push it as hard, so it's a little bit different to where when you look on the other side, on the railway, the northern team doesn't have to travel as far. However, they have the same thing like the other team on the castle side, where in the A line there's a lot of hills, there's a lot of trees and cover for, say, SPGs, tank destroyers, tanks kind of sniping from long range to set up to support the people in D9 area and E0. And the southern team, kind of the same, kind of flip-flopping. Even though the map isn't mirrored, the sides are kind of mirrored to where the blue team coming from the south on the railway in the 8 to 0, there's not a lot of cover for, say, tanks at long range trying to stay hidden, and they kind of have to push further north to get to a good spot, in E9 and also in F0. The town, again, it's not mirrored. However, more or less, the way the town shakes out is coming from the north. You can push down the 5 line pretty far to kind of help take that castle position. You can push past the halfway point, which more or less is the bridge that crosses the center. You can also push down the 6 and then the 7 line on the enemy's side, it's a little bit more risky, only because usually the enemy team will have a pretty good stronghold on the railway. However, you can push it, but it's not as far. Coming from the south, kind of the same thing, to where the right side of the river, towards the railway side, you can push that pretty hard, up to about like F7, or not F7, E7, excuse me. And then on the other side, if you choose to push there, you run a little bit of a risk to getting shot by the castle. So anyway, just going over kind of the gist of things here, and let's pop into the actual map here instead of listening to me talk about my strategy here, because you can just pop over to Lock Guru to read the full breakdown here. But just starting out a little bit here from the northern team. So this free play, this is where I started from, but more or less you can see from the northern base here, you have a pretty clear route through the center here, which most of where you're going to set up is right around the bridge here, whether it's a little north, a little south. And then the route that most people are familiar with, the old Erlenberg, you'll see that they'll try to still push the castle here, but you have to keep in mind that basically with your base here, and this is where most of your team is going to spawn, there's such a huge open space in between here and the castle, so there's not really many spots for your team to kind of set up back here. Like, there are a few bushes, but more or less trying to fire from these, if the enemy team's actually at the castle, they're going to spot you. But early on, trying to push to the castle from this side, you'll notice that your team can kind of set up in the town in a few spots to be able to support. You yourself, you either have to choose to set up on the hill here to take shots to these locations, push into the castle, or push a little bit past the castle. So one little thing that you can't really see on the mini map is there's a very small but noticeable ridge here, like kind of a hill, to where even though it's not large, you can easily set a tank up here and kind of fire north, like you used to be able to do on Erlenberg, and hit enemies trying to push into the castle a little bit too soon. And the same with trying to set up here, you'll have easy shots here to where the enemy doesn't have much or many positions to basically shoot you from here. But more or less, the castle, it kind of shakes up how it at least used to. However, there is less cover here. So if the enemy does have people in the center town, you're going to be taking a lot of fire if you're trying to push through the center here. Whereas the enemy, usually with the new Erlenberg here, they'll have most of their tanks back here, the kind of support tanks, to where basically they have no shots on you in this area until you actually say push around this corner here, which is kind of nice. They will have shots though from their hill here. Coming from the other side, just knocking the castle out here, it's similar to the north here. However, there's all these trees here, so more or less you're going to be able to fit more tanks back here than the other side, to where if you do need to say defend with just like a couple tanks up here and bait the enemy around, you're going to have a lot of support here if your team actually chooses to go there. And you also can set up on this little hill, which you'll be able to hold down. You have a couple trees for cover, and you can either fire on the enemy position here, or you can fire into the castle area or down the side wall of the castle. But more or less, advancing to the castle from the southern team coming from this side, you have a little bit more cover, and you can defend a little bit easier here because they switched as far as the entrances here up a little bit, to where it's a little bit easier to defend. However, the downside is that the enemy kind of has a easier time to kind of push in here early on if they choose so, and basically then if they have the advantage, then push into you. So looking at all of this, the way that the castle side kind of shakes out now, in my opinion, again, it all depends on how your team's actually set up, but the castle kind of shakes down to where coming from the north here, what was yellow on my map strategy, there's not a lot of cover back here. So this side, especially with the town near the river, playing a little bit more towards the center and further south to where you can push there. This side needs to play a little bit more aggressively. However, at the same time, if you overextend too early and you don't have control of the town, you're just going to be shot and torn apart from the center, because they're going to be able to hit you from this location, or even some places that they set up on their side of the river. They're going to be able to hit you given the somewhat limited cover here. So trying to push this, you need to play it a little bit aggressive but smart. You know, don't overextend. However, you don't exactly want to put, like, say, one tank, you know, basically two tanks here, maybe a tank here, and then have all your tanks sitting back here where there's no cover, no bushes, and you're not going to, you know, don't hold town, because then you're just going to get torn to shreds. Makes no sense. This side, you have a little bit more cover back here, so it might be a little bit better to defend this side. However, if you do have a lot of tanks, do note that sitting back here, albeit, you know, it has a lot of cover, a lot of bushes, a little bit of hills to work on, you don't have any shots into the castle here until the enemy actually pushes around. So you're better off setting up further onto this little hill here and to the castle and trying to contest the town, because without the town you're going to be pushing, you know, say killing tanks here, maybe clear out this hill. However, once you try to push out of the castle, you're going to have enemy tanks kind of dug in here, and basically they're just going to tear you apart because there's no cover out here. So let me zoom over to the other side here. I'm going to get to the town last. I'm just going to cover the outer flanks. So starting from the northern side again, you'll notice, let's slow this down a little bit. You'll notice that this side, much like the southern castle side back here, has a lot of trees, a lot of hills to kind of work on here, or work from here to support the railway here. Yeah, I was torn to whether to call it the railway or the windmill. I went with the railway, but more or less, you know, you can have some tanks back here supporting. However, if you put too many here, you're gonna have trouble actually trying to win this side, or, you know, trying to win the town. You know, more or less, if you put too many eggs into this basket here, you're gonna be left with this spot at the end of the match, and your team's gonna lose. All right, so more or less, you know, coming from the north here, you can have some support back here, but I wouldn't put more than, say, 2 or 3 tanks back here, to be honest, because the more you put back here, the less you're going to be able to hold the rest of the map, and Erlenberg is a pretty large map. But pushing from the north, you have 2 options. Here, you can decide whether to push the railway or kind of push the side of the railway and into the town. So starting with the railway itself here, you're going to have this hill here to where, you know, you can kind of push up. You have a little bit of cover, but more or less gun depression is definitely useful. Or else if you're like saying a really heavy tank with no gun depression or something, you're going to have to fight with very limited cover. You just have a building here, or if you get up here for some reason, you're still going to be shot from different ways, to where really medium tanks, you know, mobile heavies with gun depression, tanks like that perform well out here, light tanks with support from tank destroyers and stuff back here. But coming from the north, trying to push, holding this area, if you feel like you have a lot of tanks over here and the enemy doesn't, you can push to this hill. However, do note that pushing to this hill, like, at least you do have a building, if you do have to, like, slam the brakes on. Pushing on this hill and trying to set up here, you're going to be able to get shot from the town. And also the enemy, usually the spot they set up is basically right in this area up to this building. So you don't have much cover if the enemy actually contests this side. Whereas your teammates are all going to be back here, and you're very easily going to die, because the enemy even can say push right in here and then shoot you, you know, working back. The other spot pushing from the north here, so pushing down this flank, you have the option to kind of push a little bit into the town here. So this also has downsides, given that you're kind of on the, you know, the enemy side of the map. I know that Erlenberg's a north to south map, but more or less I feel like the southern team has an advantage on this side. Northern team has a slight advantage on the other side. So if you're trying to push into the town here, do note a lot of times the enemy will push into this little rail station here, and they can fire out at you. But you have a couple buildings here, and then trying to set up in this location, basically, so you're not getting blasted by the town and your teammates can support you. The downside being is trying to set up here. If there's a lot of enemies over, further out on the flank, on the railway side, you're going to get shot up. You're going to have a lot of tanks contesting you here potentially. So it's really high risk, high reward. But more or less it is an option. Coming from the south though, so this is kind of the flank that you're more or less, I expect the southern team to win this flank more often than not, to where with your team kind of spawning down here, basically you'll notice that there's not much cover for you to work with. It's just open field. There's some trees back here, but really they're very far out of the way to actually be useful a lot of the times, unless the enemy just gives you shots and sits right on the railway for you. But more or less pushing the railway from the south. So you have a couple spots back here to where you might be able to stay hidden, but really your shots are limited. Knowing where the enemies might be, there's the windmill off in the distance, maybe this hill here, and the town's too far away to shoot, so why go there unless, say, you're an SPG or you're TD trying to like camp back here, and maybe your team didn't put a lot of people on this side and you just want to try to help. But outside of that, it's really far out of the way to actually make tactical sense a lot of times. But early on, pushing from this flank, very easily you're able to get over to this hill here and have really nice shots on any enemies trying to push here or pushing to this hill. You even can, if you get here early enough, you can start shooting on enemies trying to push the town as well, which that's why that's a risky spot for the other team to push. Most of your tanks, however, are probably going to head for this hill. It's kind of what was there in the map before it got reworked with 1.0, and a lot of people are kind of sticking with this spot. It does make sense though, because pushing up here, you have a couple options to where if the enemy doesn't have a lot of people in the town, you can flank this way. Otherwise, just slowly work that way. But eventually you are going to kind of run into, once you get basically in between these buildings, if you're kind of fighting on the hill, don't go too up high, kind of stay towards the sides. The enemies are going to be able to hit you from here. So more or less, like, this is a flank to where it's kind of hard to push, kind of like the castle, to where once you get through it, if the enemies have a lot of people camping, you're just going to be shot by a bunch of invisible tanks, and it's really frustrating. To where sometimes it makes sense to kill the enemy as safely as you can, and where if they're kind of drawing it out and just hitting you from afar and you can't really weed them out, just kind of backtrack here. It might not be worth it to push the whole way. The same with the other side trying to push the castle. Backtrack and try to push into the town. Last but not least though, you have what I think is the most important flank on Erlenberg, the town here in the center. Now, I'm just going to kind of zoom out here, but also I'm going to bring up my map strategy one more time before getting into things here. So you can kind of see in the center, I have a few places outlined in orange. More or less, they're like neutral areas and also routes that you can take across the river. You'll notice that there's one above the bridge. There's the bridge itself. There's two crossings beneath the bridge as well, as far as north to south. So it's something to keep in mind, where even though there is only one bridge in the center of Erlenberg, there are multiple crossings that you can use without drowning yourself. And more or less, they are somewhat safe. They do present some problems where if the enemies are still spotting you, you're going to get torn up, especially if you're like a slow heavy or like a TD that's pretty large and unarmored. You're going to get hit. But they do present some tactical options available to you. All right, so more or less, let's pop back over to the map here. So as far as the routes go, you have the bridge here, but more or less you can cross. Let me zoom in here. You can cross towards you know, the little island here. You can kind of see it to where this deep area, as far as the water, you can't cross that. However, basically this entire area here, like I wouldn't cross too far this way, but basically you're able to cross this entire section. But if you more or less say you go here early on or here, you might get shot from the center. But it does provide options to you to where basically from this entrance there in the center and this entrance here and even this little cutout here, you can get across to where, you know, that's a pretty big tactical option if you know that and the enemy doesn't. You have the bridge, you have another crossing here, which the reason I say don't go too far here is even though this does look shallow, basically more or less from that cutout to this cutout, you're not able to cross. You'll drown in this. However, you can cross here as well, and then further down here you can also cross this area too. So that provides you some options. Now zooming out and looking at the town as a whole, it's somewhat mirrored in a way, but both sides are a little bit different to where is trying to get a pretty good top-down view. So coming from the north, your team mostly spawns over here. Your cap's on the other side. This is the side, you know, with the castle that you have a slight advantage on, because pushing, you're able to push pretty much to this center area near the bridge much easier than an enemy, and you even can push a little bit further if you have, say, 3 or more tanks. You can typically push past here, but if you're alone, don't extend too far here, because the enemy side is able to push from this side up to about here somewhat safely, unless, you know, they're getting shot to bits from the castle. But more or less, you know, coming from the north, you can push this side a little bit further. Coming from the south, it's set up a little bit differently to where less buildings, you have more hills here, which aren't that useful. You can kind of get up on them and shoot far away over some stuff, but more or less your shots are very limited, so it's not even worth it. This side of the town has that rail station, which is very open, so you can get hit by arty a lot easier, whereas the other side has a lot of tall walls, like, you know, basically castle walls, so that's very arty safe. This side, however, is more or less set up a little differently, where coming from the south, you can push very far into the end of kind of the station here. You can fire out onto the enemy team, whereas the enemy team trying to push over here has a little bit less cover than this side trying to push on the weak, you know, kind of the weak side of the town flank. Now, starting from this side, kind of looking at where you're going to have your shots. Early on, pushing from the south, setting up in the town, doesn't make too much sense to kind of stay here, because, you know, these roads are pointing to where your teammates are going to be. Once you get here, like, you might have a shot on the town, or not the town, the castle, excuse me, but, you know, that's not that useful. But the further you push up, basically once you get here, you might see some enemy tanks here, so you're going to have to take that into account. But pushing a little bit further, this is where you start seeing things open up a little bit more. So you have to worry about enemies here, but looking north here, you have a little bit of cover. So say if you have a tank with a lot of armor on a turret and like the upper glacis, you can kind of hold down here and shoot from relative, you know, safety. Arty's probably going to hit you, but you can shoot north on enemies trying to push here and might get you know, called out before they get to the railway. And even this way you can shoot out to where you do have cover from any enemies trying to hit you from here, unless you kind of angle out and poke out here. Looking at the other side, so coming from the north, pushing south here, it's a little bit different to where here's these castle walls to where you can set up a little bit further back. There's these buildings here. However, setting up here, you have shots, you know, in between all these buildings with some bushes to where you can hit enemies trying to push this side. There's not much cover out there for them, and I've seen that a lot of people have tried to push more towards the center on the railway than they probably should. But pushing further up, You know, you still have shots into the railway if you'd like, but pushing a little bit further up here, you know, this is where you start seeing enemy tanks. You can get shot through the end here as far as the road goes, so do take that into account, and you might get shot from across the bridge as well. But more or less, if you decide to push past here, you have the option of trying to keep pushing through the town if you want to try to, you know, weed out enemies in the castle and support your team over there. However, once you get past this kind of blown out building here, that's where you're going to start getting lit up from the trees back on the enemy side. And also, if there's enemies in the town, they're going to pick you up and start shooting you in between kind of the openings in the buildings. And with these extra crossings in the center, they're going to be able to flank you from a different spots as well. A few different spots, excuse me. However, you can kind of decide to play like this little courtyard area to where you can get shot through with the bridge. However, setting up here, you have a couple buildings and bits of cover to where you can kind of shoot into the castle if you see that that needs any help. More or less though, you know, the way Erlenberg plays, just a little bit different, you know, as far as how the map's laid out. Again, you never know how it's going to work in any specific battle that you're in, because who knows how your team's going to set up or how the enemy team is going to set up. But more or less, the center has a lot more routes across instead of just being one bridge. Has a lot more cover. The town not only has a lot more buildings, but it's a little bit wider on both sides. So the way I see Erlenberg kind of shaking out over, you know, the next several weeks and people learning to play it a little bit more in depth, are the outer flanks are nice and all. However, looking at my map strategy that I have drawn up here, which again, if you pop over to Wakuru, I have fully written, you know, breakdowns of each line for each side, so on and so forth, that go in a little bit more depth. But basically, as you can see here, I kind of ranked light tanks, medium, super heavies, so on and so forth for both teams pushing on flanks. You'll see for light tanks, you know, coming from basically both sides, the railway is a pretty good option. It's really open. Same with mediums, like castle and railway are important. Less important for lights and mediums to go into the town. Whereas once you get into tanks that are a little bit more armored, like super heavy tanks, armored tank destroyers, you kind of need to weigh your options with going to the town, because they could be pretty valuable for your team, to where if you don't have the town now, it's pretty difficult for you to win these outer flanks and then push out of them with all the open ground around it. To where I feel like once teams start learning the center of Erlenberg a little bit more and realizing that tactically you can hold the center and still help the outer flanks, that the map will, you know, kind of shake out a little bit better than it currently has. But you know, anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. 28 minutes later here. I could talk about this map for a very long time, because it's honestly, I think it's an awesome rework that they did for this. Is it perfect? Probably not, but I think from a gameplay perspective, it's really difficult for people to learn this with all the changes, especially given that they tried to keep it somewhat similar to the old Erlenberg. But I feel like, albeit a very, very difficult map in World of Tanks to play, it provides a lot of different options, and it'll be interesting to see how this actually plays out over time. But anyway, thank you very much for watching this video again. Hopefully, you know, you take a look at wakuru.com. There's a link in the video description. Also, one's going to pop up here any second now for you to kind of pop over and take a look at the full map strategy here. But anyway, you know, thanks again for watching this video. Have a very nice day. See you around. Have a good one.